Manny, it's very much a pleasure to be here, and congratulations to 3IE and a terrific 10 years. Looking forward to another great decade of work. It's my honor to be here, and I think it's appropriate in a way because I think there's a strong affinity between behavioral science and evaluation. And that's true for the following reason. One of the main lessons of behavioral science and behavioral economics, perhaps the main lesson, is that behavior and decision-making are enormously dependent on context. How you present a message, when you present it, how attractive it is, how socialized it is, how easy it is to understand, all of these things can have an outsized and unexpected impact on how people make decisions and what they eventually do. What that means is it's very hard ahead of time to know whether any particular intervention, even as something as simple as a message or a reminder, is going to make a difference unless you actually evaluate what it does subsequently. If we take behavioral science seriously, we need to really think a lot more about evaluation and spend more energy and resources in it. Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize for his pioneering work in behavioral economics a little while ago, was asked whether behavioral economics is a fad or whether it's long-lasting. There have been lots of management fads, and maybe nudging people is just another fad. That was the question. And he said, unlike other management fads over the years, the evidence on this is very strong. In fact, in the future, behavioral economics won't exist, he said, because it'll just be economics. Everyone going through graduate school in economics will have training in behavioral economics, and what they do will automatically incorporate the knowledge of the importance of context on behavior. So that's the good news, I think, for those of us interested in evaluation. Behavioral science gives us another reason, and an important reason, to focus on it very hard. So that's the good news. Manny started with some good news, some bad news, and then told you the good news. I starting with some good news, and I'm going to give you some bad news, which is that I'm going to make you do some math very early in the morning. We're going to play a game called Add 3 that cognitive psychologists have put up. I'm going to give you a 4-digit number. What I want you to do is to add 3 to each of the digits. So if I put up 1, 2, 3, 4, the answer is 4, 5, 6, 7. If there's a 7 or an 8 or a 9, add 3, but don't carry the 1. I don't want to get too sophisticated early in the morning. Okay, are you ready? Answer? 7684. Here we go. Answer? 4691. Ready? Answer? 2507. Last one. Hang in there. 5142. Now, if you are like the average subject in Daniel Kahneman's classic experiment, your heart rate has just gone up 7 beats a minute. Your pupils have dilated 50%. And this is not a question of it being out in public or early in the morning. This would have happened even in the privacy of the lab after you've had your coffee. Thinking hard actually consumes biological energy. That's why we try and avoid thinking hard whenever we can, to be honest. As a result, our brain has developed a parallel system of making decisions. Cognitive psychologists will call this System 1, which we make decisions very quickly based on intuitive rules of thumb or heuristics. These are very powerful, and they're very effective much of the time. If you want to know whether your boss is mad at you, you don't need to spend much energy figuring that out. If you want to compare, say, the length of 2 objects, which finger is longer, you quickly can determine that. But then try and determine 2 ratios, that's more cognitively demanding. Most of the time, these heuristics are very effective, but there are systematic biases built into them. Sometimes these systematic biases lead us astray. We used to think that these biases were random. We don't know why someone made a mistake, he or she just did. But now we know from a few decades of research in cognitive social psychology and related disciplines that there are systematic biases. People are, to quote a book from Dan Ariely, predictably irrational, not just irrational. And we can use these predictions to improve policymaking. Now, here's another math problem for you. Answer? Any guesses? Anything? All right, let's try another one. This one. It's the same, right? You know that. At least we know that. Now, in this experiment, people were shown these two. The first group guessed 512. Second group guessed 2,250. Both groups were wildly wrong. But the striking thing here is that systematically, when they were shown the first answer, the guess was lower than the second answer, because it starts with a 1, whereas the second series starts with an 8. People were anchoring on that first digit, and that was leading them astray. This is a very powerful finding. If I ask you right now, if I were to ask you to write down your national ID number, the last 2 digits of it, then ask you to guess the price of a bottle of wine or the height of Mount Kilimanjaro, those of you with higher ID numbers would guess systematically higher for the height of Mount Kilimanjaro than those of you with lower numbers. And anchoring is everywhere. If you're out buying a pair of jeans and it costs 2,000 rupees, you think, I don't know, is that good or bad? I don't know. And then you see another pair of jeans that's 25% off. Suddenly you think, I can get 4 for the price of 3. It's a great deal. We anchor all the time. We do it in policy. When, for instance, we're evaluating a cash transfer program, it may make a difference whether, when presenting the information to the beneficiaries, we say you're getting, 2,000 or 3,000 rupees a month for 12 months, or for 12 months, I'll give you 3,000 or 4,000 rupees. Small differences like that can make a big difference in policy. As Manny mentioned, in 2015, we wrote a World Development Report, which summarized the cognitive science, the social psychology, the behavioral economics, and presented a host of examples from across the disciplines for how this is relevant for development policy. Our main message was that development policy is due for a redesign based on a more realistic understanding of how people think and behave. In that report, we had a guiding metaphor, which was a cockpit. This is a cockpit from the Concorde airplane, which no longer flies, perhaps because the cockpit looks like this. Over time, more and more instruments were added with the idea that this will help pilots fly. But each additional instrument was cognitively demanding. Pilots had to scan all these dials, remember what they said, then integrate the information when it came time to make a decision, like choosing an angle of approach. This was shown to be related to pilot error. Modern cockpits look more like this. As a result of technology, you can integrate information into one panel, so that a picture of flight path shows you altitude, position, velocity, all in one picture. It's much easier. Pilot error, as a result, simulation show, has gone down. So this is our guiding metaphor. Just as pilots use information to fly airplanes, individuals use the information around them to chart their course through life. Boeing, Airbus, other organizations like that realize the stakes are very high when pilots fly airplanes. So they redesign the cockpit to help people make better decisions. We in the development community also work with people for whom the stakes are very high. In fact, much, much higher. Less than 1,000 people die of plane accidents in a given year. There are 7.5 million people around the world who die, 7.5 million kids who die from preventable diseases. The stakes are actually higher. So just as Airbus and Boeing redesigned the cockpit, we should redesign the incentives, information, the environment that people we're working with receive so that they can make better decisions over the course of their life. 2 additional points about this cockpit. The first is that notice that the usual tools of policy, incentives or a law, wouldn't necessarily make a difference. The incentives for a pilot are already really high. You can't really enforce a law telling a pilot to scan this or that. Those traditional tools don't necessarily work in some contexts. We need a new tool, a new set of tools, and that's what behavioral economics and behavioral science, behavioral insights, that's what it provides. Secondly, it's also true that the social environment matters. Studies show that captains issue twice as many orders as first officers, and when first officers issue an order, they tend to be tentative, suggestion rather than order, which is not what you want. Imagine a plane going down to land and the wheels aren't down yet. You don't want the first officer to say, maybe we should think about possibly maybe lowering the wheels now. That's not what you want. Hierarchy matters for decision making. A 2013 study of the American Heart Association showed that hierarchy in the operating room was linked to errors on the part of cardiac surgeons. Because if people aren't comfortable speaking up, that cardiac surgeon's more likely to make a mistake. In the traditional development economics paradigm, people carefully weigh all their choices, figure out calculating costs and benefits. They make decisions by and for themselves, and they consider all readily available information. In the framework for our report, we argue that people think automatically. They use these heuristics that I mentioned. People think socially. Their decisions and behavior depend a lot on what people around them are doing. It's not a decision by or for yourself. And people think with mental models. They don't necessarily use all readily available information because the models in their head filter which information they're actually able to receive. This is now a widespread part of policymaking, this idea. This slide from the OECD shows that there are over 130 public bodies around the world that have institutionalized behavioral insights. At the World Bank, as Manny mentioned, we have a Mind, Behavior, and Development Unit, or MBED, as we like to call ourselves. We work inside the World Bank with governments and with project teams trying to use this framework and these insights to make policies and programs better. In terms of how we work, we invest a lot of time understanding and diagnosing context because, as I mentioned, the context, small changes really matter for decision making, and it's important to really understand that before you design an intervention. We're evidence-based. We test and evaluate everything we do. We try and make our evaluations timely so that they can feed back into policy because we want to iterate and adapt policy as it goes forward. Let me give you a couple examples of our recent work. The first involves improving student performance in Peru. This was a study with 250,000 kids in Lima and in areas outside of Lima as well. This involved the use of something developed by the psychologist Carol Dweck called growth mindset. You may have heard this idea. It's the idea that student beliefs about learning affect their learning. If you're trying to get a student to learn, traditionally what you do is say, if you don't get good grades, I'm going to spank you, right? Or I'll give you candy if you do well. You'd use incentives, something like that, to try and get students to work harder. But what if it's not effort, but just an understanding of how to learn? What if that's the bottleneck? The idea is that some students might think there's no point in studying because they're just dumb, right? There's no point in learning. I'm stuck in my life. It's a fatalistic attitude. But if you teach people to believe in the idea that learning actually changes your brain, that you're not stuck, maybe that'll have some results. So the team worked with kids to write essays about this idea and present information about neuroplasticity. The idea is that throughout our lives, neurons keep rewiring, and in fact, when you learn and think hard, you actually make physiological changes. You're not stuck. Students got a 2-hour lesson on this idea. There were some posters in some schools that showed the brain is like a muscle. You know, it's sort of like the more you exercise it, the more it grows. And then we did some evaluations. What we found is that just after 2 months later, students took a standardized test, and you had a 0.1 standard deviation increase in math and reading scores in schools outside of Lima. This persisted 14 months later during the next year's standardized tests. So this intervention cost about 20 cents per student to put in, and 0.1 standard deviations is almost a full year of learning. So as if students were testing in math and reading a full year later. We're now rolling this out in Indonesia with about 250,000 students and in South Africa as well. And we're going to try use new means of delivery. We're going to try and do it with videos. There's something called Class Dojo, which provides information on curriculum online. We're going to try and use that because if this works, we want to see if we can do it at scale with sort of new technologies as well. That's the first example. Another example involves activating the social norm of tax payments. And this is work from the Behavioural Insights team in the UK that I'm referencing now. People were paying their taxes late in the UK, so the idea was just to add one sentence to the letters that people were receiving. They received letters that said, in fact, 9 out of 10 people pay their taxes on time, 9 out of 10 people in the UK pay their taxes on time, 9 out of 10 people pay their taxes on time, and you are in the very small minority who has not paid us yet. Paying taxes means we all gain from vital services. Paying taxes mean we all lose. And the results were just adding a sentence, which costs almost nothing, increased tax payments by up to 5% in the social norms treatment. A World Bank team tried this in Guatemala, which has the lowest ratio of tax revenues to GDP in the world, and found that the social norms treatment also increased tax payments in Guatemala by about 5%. This was not paying taxes on time, but actually paying your taxes, period, in Guatemala. And this effect persisted again a year later. A tiny little sentence had a big impact on tax payments. So then we tried this in Poland, with several 100,000 recipients. We had 9 different treatment arms with 9 different versions of a letter. We wanted to see if it worked in Poland. Typically, tax departments will send something out called a dunning letter. It's a very complicated legal letter. You pursuant to clause this, because of that, and it's mind-boggling for people to understand. So we simplified the letter and also tried 9 different treatments, and found that in Poland, you got a similar, 4 to 8 percentage point increase in the people paying their taxes. This was paying taxes on time. But unlike Guatemala and the UK, the social norms treatment, though effective, was less effective than the hard deterrence treatment, saying now we're watching you, basically. We don't know why the hard tone was more powerful than the soft tone in Poland. We have a speculation that in a post-communist society, people are tired of hearing about social norms. We don't know. Again, raises the importance of testing things and evaluating them in context, because we didn't know ahead of time whether this was going to work. Relatedly, we had an intervention in Tanzania using SMS messages to increase savings. Some people got a simple, there's a control group. Some people were gotten text messages saying, remember to save. We partnered with Busara, a lab in Kenya. Another message emphasized agency, another mental accounting, and then finally social influence. And what we found was that the first 2 actually slightly lowered savings, but the social influence one raised savings. Motivating healthcare workers in Nigeria. Here the problem was that there's a lot of, there's leakage of resources in Nigeria. The World Bank is working for some time on public expenditure tracking to try and track the resources going to clinics and healthcare facilities. But the problem is that sometimes people don't even fill out the forms to track how much is coming. So it's hard to actually monitor. So we tried to motivate healthcare workers to fill out their forms. There were 2 treatments. One was a lottery. If they did a good job, they were entered in a lottery to win a smartphone. The other was social recognition. They got a star, and eventually they got a chance to shake the hand of a significant public official if they did a good job. We found the lottery treatment didn't work, which surprised us a bit, but the social recognition one did. But it only worked in one of the states. It worked in AKT, but not in Niger state. Not exactly sure why. It may be that there's a lot of facility tracking data. We incorporated all that data, looked at all, the heterogeneity at the facility level. That didn't work, so we're not quite sure. We think it may have something to do with the management structure in the 2 states. In partnership with Athena Economics and the Environmental Action Group in Gorakhpur and Berkeley, and with support from 3IE, we did an intervention in UP to try and motivate latrine use among toilet owners. As you know, actually using latrines is a big problem, even among people who own them in India. We first did a long diagnosis to measure social norms around this. We've developed a technique for actually measuring social norms. What we found is that people were underestimating the usage of latrines on the part of toilet owners. We're not exactly sure why. It may well be because when people defecate in the fields, that's visible. When people use a latrine, it's less visible. So then we put together some posters to say that in fact, lots of people are using latrines. In fact, they're cleaner, to trying to get at this idea of the mental model of what's clean and what's dirty, to say latrines are actually clean, even though they're clean promoting behavior. They're anti-gandagi behavior. And then we also compared latrines in these posters to other kinds of ways to promote cleanliness. Very small sample in a handful of villages. some issues of balance among the treatment arms, but we found that both the mass communications and mass communications tied to norm entrepreneurs who are motivated to get the message out made a difference in actually increasing self-reported latrine use. Intervention in Peru in partnership with the Behavioral Insights team, trying to motivate teacher attendance. Teacher attendance is a big problem around the world, of course. There were 2 messages targeted to school directors and to teachers, trying to motivate them to show up. These were emails that looked like this. For teachers, basically we found no impact of the email. We did find an impact of an increase in 3.7 percentage points for school directors. It may be the case that school directors open their emails more often than teachers. We'll need to go back and dig into why. We have a related project now. This is sort of ongoing projects. We have one in Guatemala in which the World Bank team, along with the government, has developed a method to predict which students are likely to drop out in the transition from primary to secondary school. About a third of the kids drop out. So we're going to be giving all school directors in the entire country information about this. Some will receive a list of students to target, and some will get some social motivation to actually target, to take action with respect to those kids. We have a number of interventions. Oh, this is just what I just mentioned. We have a number of interventions in the energy efficiency space. An important one involves benchmarking your energy consumption to your neighbors, because people often don't know what's an appropriate amount of energy to use. And we're starting some work in a number of countries in Africa on the take-up of technologies, biogas stoves and off-grid solar. Generally, technology take-up is an important challenge that Behavioral Insights can make a difference on. Cash transfer modernization in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, there's an effort to modernize cash transfers, to make them digital, but the caseworkers are overloaded, so we're designing some interventions to help caseworkers with an app to help them sort of improve their efficiency and motivate them through inspirational videos. We have a number of interventions using cognitive behavioral therapy to help people deal with resilience, particularly in areas of conflict. So the last topic I want to address is that I've described a number of our projects and how they affect the behavior of citizens, consumers, beneficiaries. But of course, the people who have biases are not just citizens, beneficiaries, and consumers, but everybody, including policymakers. All of us, in this room on the donor side, we also have biases. In the World Development Report, we tested this idea, adapting some work by Dan Kahan at Yale Law School. We asked World Bank staff, okay, there's sort of an action X and action Y. There's a good outcome, a bad outcome. Here's the data. Basically, World Bank staff were asked to evaluate a 2-by-2 table. In one framing, it was about skin cream. It was whether the skin cream was effective or not. In another framing, it was about the minimum wage, but whether the minimum wage raises or lowers poverty rates. Of course, the minimum wage is an ideologically charged issue for economists for sure, and in the general public also. Skin cream is not usually ideological. We asked World Bank staff what they thought, to give us the right answer, and there was a right answer in this 2-by-2 table, about which is more effective. What we found is that World Bank staff are more likely to get the right answer in the skin cream vignette than in the minimum wage vignette. You might think, wow, this is surprising. World Bank staff did this even though, despite the fact that they're trained in economics. Well, that's sort of getting it, a little backwards. It happened because they're trained in economics, right? It's because they thought they knew the answer and didn't do the math, right? So they were bringing a mental model to the problem. And then we used some data from the World Value Survey. We used a question from the World Value Survey to ask World Bank staff about their priors. Is wage equality good, or because we should behave equal, or is it bad because we need some inequality to motivate effort? And we found that World Bank staff are more likely to get the answer wrong when it conflicted with their priors. So we have biases. We need to de-bias ourselves. Now, is this a World Bank problem? We did it in DFID in the UK as well. Got almost identical numbers in DFID in DFID. So we have problems where this might be a broader problem. We're working now inside our institution, to bring behavioral insights to work in our institution. The World Bank has a target for gender equality in the senior management level. We're working to improve the hiring process to reduce bias. We're working to improve knowledge sharing in the World Bank because we're not necessarily always good at sort of transferring knowledge among ourselves, and working to make the institution more effective, more agile. So final messages. The takeaways, I would say, is that first, it's important to conduct pre-diagnosis and diagnosis, and that means asking the right questions. Just about wrapping up. And here I would say that pre-diagnosis is really crucial. Typically when we do a diagnosis, we just ask people, are you likely to use this latrine? Hey, are you likely to go to work if we provide, a daycare? People do things for reasons they don't know. Most of your day, you do things for reasons you don't understand. They're not top of mind. So if I ask you, are you likely to go to work if I provide, you transportation? You might say yes, but you yourself have no idea. So we have to do pre-diagnosis in a different way and not simply rely on attitudinal responses and focus groups and the variety of techniques to do this that we're developing and other people have developed over time. Context is important for decision making. There's different kinds of context. The context of the situation, there's the context of the organization, and then there's the culture. We typically think a lot of the culture, but sometimes the situation and the organization are really as important. We need to think about decision-making principles. People think automatically, socially, and with mental models, and then finally test, learn, and adapt. And let me sort of close and leave you with this final thought, which is that in Manny's illustrious career, one of his tasks was to be director of the 2007 World Development Report on development in the next generation. It was about youth. And I worked with him on that team, under him on that team. And one of the things we found was that at that time, behavioral economics was not as developed, but there was a body of literature coming out about how young people can be myopic, short-sighted, have self-control issues. If you have a teenager, you know this is an issue. And so young people aren't necessarily fully rational. Well, the good news from behavioral economics and behavioral science is that everyone, including people like Manny and me, are young people now.